All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to our fifth, I believe, and final webinar of all series of webinars on trends and lessons from ATD 2016. Just for housekeeping purposes, to make sure that those of you online with us are hearing us properly, I'd like to ask those of you dialed in to maybe type into the chat box on the bottom left-hand corner of your viewing screen. Just let us know if you're hearing us okay, if the sound is great. Thank you, Noor. Sounds like the sound is good on your end. Richard, thank you. All right, so it sounds like our sound is good. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to try and briefly set up the why behind this series of webinars. Essentially, attended the ATD, Association for Talent Development conference in Denver, Colorado back in May. Came back fully inspired by all the ideas and content that we had heard, and we were looking for ways in which we could maximize our learning and make it stick to a certain extent. And so the thought came to us as I was chatting with a colleague on the flight back from Denver that maybe it'd be a great idea to start a series of webinars. And so today, we are at the final step of our series, which was called Trends and Lessons from ATD. I'm going to introduce myself really briefly. I'm Cheddi Suddith, leader of leadership development, or regional leader leadership development here in our Toronto office. And I have the pleasure of welcoming today a host, or the host, I should say, speaker, Warren Cohen. Warren, welcome.
Thank you, Cheddi. Good to be here.
The title of our session, Trends and Challenges in Talent Development. And I'll take a few seconds to set this up a little bit. In previous communications and webinars, we identified and talked about the fact that the world of learning and development is changing rapidly. And when you think about advent and advances in technology and ease of access to information, and probably because also of the speed at which the classical hard knowledge becomes obsolete these days due to ever so rapidly changing and evolving organizations, the need for learning and development to be perceived as a more fluid, continuous, growing, and less hard and static approach becomes much more important. And so this is where, Warren, I'd like for you to maybe start by telling us a little bit about your experience at ATD 2016. That's where we met, you and I. I knew the folks from coaching ourselves before, but it was the first time that you and I met. So maybe tell us a little bit about what you learned there.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you for allowing me to be part of your webinar series. I'm excited to share some ideas with your participants. So I was lucky enough to attend ATD 2016, which took place in Denver, Colorado. I was also lucky enough to be part of the last four to five of the last ATD global conferences. And having attended these conferences, I've seen a trend that has been building over the last 5 years, and even over the last 10 years, I guess you could say. So let me share some of those trends with your listeners. And you'll see on our first slide that what I found was not only was I able to attend some of the speaker presentations, but I was also able to be part of, on the exhibitor floor, coaching ourselves, had a booth on the floor, and I was able to interact and understand the challenges from L&D and HR people from around the globe. So what I found in attending the speaker presentations was that growing number of these presentations included many different elements of social learning, whether they were elements of coaching or mentoring or group interactions in general. I was also lucky enough to attend the 3 keynote speaking sessions, and the common theme that came out of these 3 sessions was that people need to learn from each other. I remember listening specifically to Simon Sinek's keynote presentation, and at one point during it really was. He's so inspiring and so he breaks down his ideas into a very practical way for his listeners. So at one point during his presentation, he asked the question, how do we get people to learn from each other? And that was the big thing that people are trying to figure out. And I was sitting in this audience of about 5,000 people, I remember at the time. And I was dying to just jump up, raise my hand and say, Mintzberg has figured this out. We know how to do it. Let me explain to you. And that's what I'm going to do hopefully over the next half an hour or so with your listeners.
Great.
So what did we learn specifically at ATD, having attended the presentations and been on the exhibition floor? Number 1, managers don't want to be in a classroom. They want to learn, they want to develop, but they just found that the traditional ways of learning, sitting in a classroom for half-day, full-day, even 2-day sessions, just wasn't compatible with their work lives. Being away from their work means buildup of emails, lost time with clients, and so on. And they're looking for different ways to develop. Secondly, learning needs to be in the context of work. So it's fine and dandy so that we can sit down and listen to somebody lecture us on management and leadership and how we can do things better. But unless we can relate it to our actual work and our actual work experiences, it doesn't become meaningful learning for us. Number 3, back to what Simon was talking about. L&D professionals need to figure out how to get people to learn from each other. It's an aging workforce. Succession planning is one of the key elements of talent development these days, and we need a way to be able to effectively transfer the tacit knowledge that is present in organizations. And as I mentioned on this slide, everything seems to be pointing towards social learning.
That certainly rings true to me. I got a big smile and a bit of a chuckle when you talk about the buildup of emails when you're in the classroom setting. It's a concern not only for participants but facilitators as well. And so, and it reminds me, what you just brought up here kind of reminds me of in a previous webinar, I attempted to summarize Hakoon's model, COMA model on learning and development initiatives as effectiveness, and talked about the BOM model, and the O part being opportunities, opportunities to review and to practice and to apply and to discuss and exchange. And so without that, knowledge is useless. And so I guess I'll send you the question then.
Absolutely.
I was going to say, if everything seems to be pointing towards social learning, then what is it?
So, good question, thank you, and we're going to define that for you. So what is social learning exactly? It can be defined as interacting with others to make sense of experiences and new ideas. Unfortunately, some people seem to mix up social learning with what they call social media. And social media is simply technology that's used to engage 3 or more people. So examples of social media are YouTube videos, Wikipedia, blogs. And these are very effective tools for people to learn. Now, you take YouTube, for example, where the producers of the content and the consumers of the content are one and the same. And there's some very effective and useful tools within YouTube, and people get to create the material, create the content, share the content, it's categorized, it's consumed, and ultimately it's rated. All very useful tools, but this is far from social learning. This is simply the use of technology and a social media tool to let's call it transfer some type of information. Many organizations I know have allowed some of their employees to create these how-to videos on YouTube and share them with their internal employees. And as I said, effective way to transfer knowledge, but it's really not social learning in any sense. I'll get on to now. So I'm going to differentiate for you the difference between Cartesian learning or traditional learning and social learning. The traditional way that people learn has always been a Cartesian view. And that's where you're learning typically one-on-one from an expert or an academic, for instance. Knowledge is treated as a substance, and the pedagogy is the way that the knowledge is transferred. So, whereas in social learning and the social view of learning, it's more about how the learning is constructed through interactions, through discussions with peers, with others in the organization, and always focuses around reflection and dialogue. And in the case of social learning, how we learn is almost more important than what we learn. Okay? So if you can move over to the next slide, I'll give you an example of what social learning is not. And here we see a picture of a traditional classroom. We've got the so-called sage on the stage. He's imparting knowledge. And what these people here are learning is typically about management and leadership. They're certainly not learning on how to become better managers and leaders. So there's a very big difference in the two situations here. And I'll get onto that a little bit deeper as we move through the discussion.
And that's great. It's certainly that image doesn't look very social, or the previous one, I should say, doesn't look very social to me. And so, maybe you could share with us a little bit of what you've seen here in terms of trends. Yes, so it's possible that many of our listeners are familiar with Bersin, the Bersin report. Bersin has recently been purchased by a Deloitte group. And Bersin traditionally is an organization that studies talent development on a global scale. They'll put out large surveys to, in this case, over 3,000 medium and large size organizations. And what they found, the trends that they found, was that the #1 issue for senior management, executive leadership, is culture and engagement. Those are the top 2 issues that they're facing as they try to help the organization progress. He also determined that it's leadership development that drives the culture and engagement in organizations. And right back to what I was talking about previously, how managers learn is actually more important than what they learn. So a couple of ideas here that was put forth by Josh Bersin in his study, and he wrote a very interesting paper about a year ago on what he calls the self-developing organization. And he says learning should definitely not be treated as an event. Rather, learning should be treated as a continuous performance improvement process. He says that leaders in organizations need to take the time, and they need to understand that it's their responsibility to teach and coach members of their team. And they need to be rewarded for it. They need to understand that, wow, I'm a manager, I'm a leader in an organization, and a key and critical part of my job is I need to develop others.
whether the others are peers or whether the others are underneath them in the organization. So they get, Burson found out that many organizations are actually getting leaders to teach different classes and workshops, which helps deliver and transfer their own tacit knowledge. And learning needs to be valued as part of the culture of the organization. That's the ultimate goal, creating learning organizations, creating organizations that are going to develop by themselves.
If I can interject here, Warren, a little bit, I want to touch on that last point, because it's an important one, learning being valued as part of the culture.
Yep.
Here, I'll just go back up here. Usually, we know that aspect of developing a learning culture is facilitated or enhanced when our leaders and, more importantly, or probably predominantly the senior leadership, show interest in developing talent. And we recently did a breakfast conference on that. Have you found in your experience that there's, what's your take on how much buy-in you've seen from senior leaders for, showing interest in learning and putting forth the, philosophy of continuous learning and development?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, Cheddi. Of course, the number one priority of leaders and senior leaders in many organizations these days is how do we help grow this business?
Yeah.
How do we improve the numbers in many cases? And unfortunately, they don't always see the connection between learning and development of people in the organization as part of improving the performance of the organization as a whole. They're more concerned oftentimes with day-to-day and getting their projects out the door and helping the numbers and the revenue ultimately increase. So it definitely is a challenge. But I'm going to touch a little bit further down the line on that challenge, and I'll show you where that's been trending. Okay.
Great. Yep. Thanks.
So once again, a little bit more about learning about versus learning to be, and I talked about that in the slide showing the traditional classroom. Typically, learning about management is fine and dandy, and leadership, but we believe, certainly at Coaching Ourselves, and many of the experts have said that management and leadership is not something that can be learned in a classroom. It needs to be learned on the job, through experiences, through sharing our experiences with our peers, and ultimately making sense of those experiences. I'll move on to the next slide, and I imagine that many of our listeners are familiar with Henry Mintzberg. Henry's been known for his theories on organizational forms, emergent strategy, but in the last 15 or so years, more specifically for his research and his ideas on management education, how managers and leaders best learn. Henry started his thoughts on education way back in 1973. He conducted what I believe is the first observational study on what managers actually do on the job. And what he did is he observed 29 different managers from 29 different organizations, senior and higher level managers. And what he found out was quite surprising. Very different from what the traditional business thinkers and what the traditional academics always thought about management and what they were writing about management. They were writing that management is typically about planning and controlling and agendas and creating strategy and those sorts of things. And what Mintzberg found out was that managing is not that at all. managing is about getting interrupted. And when he says interrupted, typically on average anywhere between 5 and 7 minutes before the next interruption is happening. It's typically about trying to keep your head above water as you run around and try and make things happen. So Henry wrote this down, and that became his first book, called The Nature of Managerial Work. And what Henry said about 20 years after that study, as he did more research on how managers best learn, he found out that the traditional methods that were being used in many of the business schools were not the best ways for managers and leaders to learn. The traditional business schools were using, more often than not, the case study method. We're all familiar with the case study method. It's been used in Harvard University and many other business schools around the world. In the case study method, as we're mostly familiar, groups of people get opportunities to read a 15-20 page document about either a fictional organization with actors playing different roles, and then they get to swoop in and provide their ideas on how this organization can improve. What Henry and some of his colleagues found out was that this is definitely not the most powerful way for leaders and managers to learn. He believed that instead of reflecting on other people's experiences and making decisions on those experiences, he believed that managers should reflect on their own experiences in the workplace. They have an emotional attachment to their own experience. They can relate to that experience, something that happened to them yesterday or last week or last month on the job. And what he adds to that reflection on that experience is that it needs to be in light of conceptual ideas. What he means is that provide some concepts, some ideas, some various perspectives on different themes of management and leadership, and use those ideas as a lens so that we view our own experience in a new way and come up with new ideas and insights on how we can improve the way we practice management. Management is not a science. Management is a practice. We need to practice this and learn through our experiences. And that's what Henry did. So with his colleagues, he established his International Master's Program back in 1996, both with McGill University and a consortium of 4 universities around the world. And since 1996, he's been using this idea of reflection on our natural experience, using some ideas from the academics, from the business thinkers, so that we view our own experiences differently, share these experiences, discuss them with our peers, and ultimately that brings meaning to those experiences and comes meaningful learning.
You know, it reminds me, Warren, as you described this, I was envisioning a continuum of, learning approaches where, if you will imagine, on the far left side of the continuum, you would have the hard data, static knowledge. And then moving progressively towards the right side of the continuum, you get things like a case study, which is an application of knowledge, but it's still, black and white on paper, and, generates some thought, but with a certain detachment, or certainly an emotional or experiential detachment from it. You're thinking about, as you mentioned, somebody else's experience. And then as you move further right, you get things like a simulation. And you can think of a simulation as a pilot simulator where, you're actually sitting in the seat. Those of you who like the Star Trek movies will remember that there is some simulation going on in the most recent series. And so that's even closer to the experience because now you're engaged in it. But, on the far right, then I'm thinking, okay, but now you're looking at actually lived experience. And as you mentioned, I think it's that emotional component that's sort of, you can't know how you're going to react and reflect and what you want to apply and how to apply it until you've had the opportunity to experience it a little bit. Does that make sense to
Yeah,
you?
absolutely, absolutely. You know, me and you, and probably most of our listeners, we drive home at night after a day in the workplace, or we're on the train perhaps, and we reflect on what happened to us during the day. And that can be very meaningful for us, but what's missing from that is being able to share that reflection, that experience that we had during the day with our peers, the actual act of articulating that experience, and then injecting some form of conceptual material, some ideas or perspectives, through which we're forced to view our experience in a little bit of a different manner. That's what really creates the effective learning for us. So instead of just reflecting on something that happened, the actual sharing, the articulating, and the discussing with our peers is what's going to help us turn that happening, something that happened to us during the day, into something that is meaningful learning and that will stay with us. So Mintzberg, through this program, this international master's program that he created back in 1996, one of the elements of that program was small group discussion. Managers and leaders coming from different organizations around the globe and bringing their experiences to the table. And you may have the professors of that business program who are injecting some ideas and perspectives so that the participants can talk about their experiences a little bit differently and improve the way that they practice management and leadership and get ideas from each other and support and feedback. So these he started to call peer coaching groups, small groups that get together for brief and short bursts of learning, sharing ideas. And so why peer coaching groups? Very simply, because we're all human beings. And we're not human resources, and there's a big distinction between human beings and human resources. Our listeners, I'm sure, either work or worked for human resource departments in the past. And unfortunately, we still call them human resource departments. But in fact, we're all human beings. And it's about real human interactions that are most powerful for us. So Mintzberg kind of encapsulated this in one sentence, and he said the best organizations are communities of engaged human beings, not collections of detached human resources. And I'll touch on the idea of communities in organizations a little further on. So at Coaching Ourselves, and I'm an expert in the Coaching Ourselves methodology of social learning, and what it is, very simply, it's a small group of managers helping one another improve their practice of management through reflection and dialogue. Peer coaching groups are small, highly productive communities of practice. We believe that 75 to 90-minute sessions are the most effective length for sessions, long enough to expand on ideas, share our experiences with our peers, but short enough so that, after a couple of hours, it seems that managers, and research has shown this, that participants of groups, managers in general, kind of disengage. So 90 minutes really have been determined to be the right amount of time for effective learning. These groups are supported by a facilitator. Sometimes that facilitator role can be taken on by simply the leader of the group. And that can be a peer within the group. Natural leaders emerge, and they're simply there to keep the process rolling, okay? And in Coaching Ourselves, we use one of our 80 different modules to kind of guide and spark these reflective discussions among the small groups, okay? And that's yeah, go ahead, Cheddi.
I was going to ask, Warren, in your experience, because I've done some of these peer-to-peer coaching groups, some of them supported by the Coaching Ourselves approach and material, and some without. Have you found that there are some people who are better at participating in these and being effective coaches than others? And if so, what would you recommend, or how would you define who's best suited for this?
So, good question. Generally what we found, and we've been in business for over 10 years, we found that business people typically know how to behave in meetings, especially in meetings where they're not quite sure and don't quite trust the process yet. They typically have filters up, and these filters help them to share what they feel comfortable with. So what we found in coaching ourselves is that at least the first couple of times that groups get together to experience the process of reflective dialogue, sharing their experiences, and using some material to guide those discussions, they should be led by someone who has understood, who really understands the process of coaching ourselves and understands the process of group peer coaching. So, once they've been exposed to this process and they start to develop a little trust for their peers and trust the process as well, it kind of becomes a natural coaching session. People understand that, they're not being judged. This becomes a safe space for them. This becomes a space where they can not only share what they do on a regular basis on the job, but they can also comment on what peers have done and offer new suggestions and new ideas. So it's quite interesting to see these natural leaders emerge in these groups and start to get comfortable. And you not only see this behavior emerge during the reflective discussions, but once people go back to the job, back into their workplaces, they really start to elicit this coaching, this natural and organic coaching style that comes out of them that they developed initially in these peer coaching discussions.
I would agree with you that that it develops, and I was asking the question purposefully because I've been in scenarios or situations where that notion of judgment that you mentioned, it's the difference between learning and judging, if you will, in a coaching mindset. And I found that when we do it, the idea of having a facilitator there present initially is really helpful, because you almost need to coach people how to be effective coaches in those sessions, because otherwise they'll ask more judgmental questions and closed-ended questions, which really don't generate or facilitate great insights. And that portion of trust is also very important. So I'm with you on the, it evolves, it develops, and at first you kind of want to have someone there to sort of interject where needed.
Absolutely, and it takes different number of group discussions. In other words, different amounts of sessions for different people. Some people, and in groups that work together, intact teams per se, are comfortable with each other right away, and they can dive right into some of these ideas and concepts and relate their own experiences and share these experiences very openly. Whereas other groups, cross-functional managers perhaps, that have come together from different divisions or different departments within an organization, it may take them a little bit longer till they really start to trust each other and develop those relationships. And so you may see, it takes 3 or 4 sessions before they really start to engage and openly sharing on a personal level rather than at a high level or organizational level.
We've got a question from the audience. Warren Marie asks, what do you think of the idea of gathering managers, similar or same level managers, but from different realms, different industry, different areas of activity?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just sort of touched on that quickly, but different organizations take different approaches to peer coaching groups. Some believe that they can be and are more powerful when you have intact teams working together in these groups that work regularly, close together. They know each other. They can talk about similar challenges and similar projects to get out the door together. Whereas other organizations believe that bringing managers from cross-functional areas of the business, different departments, really provides an opportunity for them to network, to build those networks, and understand that other managers in different departments have similar challenges to mine. And this becomes a very human way of building relationships and understanding and building empathy for each other, understanding how it feels to walk in someone else's shoes, even in the same organization, and that they have similar challenges to me. And how can I use some of their ideas or some of their feedback to improve the way that I do things? And maybe I can offer them some ideas at the same time. So it's a fantastic way to break down silos, first of all, in organizations, understand how we can improve the way we manage across these silos, and get to know people that you may never have had opportunities to get to know in the past.
I'm going to guess that... sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I hope I've answered the question for Marie. But, you know, as I said, it's very dependent on what the organization wants to tackle. And if silo busting is one of their challenges, then putting together peer groups from different areas of the business is a fantastic way to do it.
Marie thanks you for that answer, says it does meet her expectations, or does answer the question. I'm going to guess that, you know, framing the purpose of these meetings effectively when you're holding them within organization with a group of individuals from the same company becomes really important, because I can envision a scenario where people get into these meetings and move into action planning and problem solving on their operational issues, as opposed to talking about, you know, management and learning how to be managers.
Absolutely, yes. And so it's not only a development session on a personal level, but it absolutely can be a wonderful problem-solving session when you bring managers together to talk about experiences and things that they're trying to accomplish together.
You know, in this model that I was referring to earlier about, you know, learning and development effectiveness, or initiatives as effectiveness, the last letter stands for M, as in measurement. You know, if you're going to create a learning initiative, then the only way to define ROI is to try and measure the impact of it. Have you, you know, is social learning, this method, something that can be measured? And if so, you know, how can that be done?
Huge challenge, yes. As we all know, measuring of any type of leadership, management, development program is a big challenge. Very difficult to do. But there are various ways that we can measure them. And I'll talk about specifically an organization that Coaching Ourselves has been working with for probably 5 to 6 years now. The organization is Fujitsu. They're a large organization. It's a division of Fujitsu in general. This is the Fujitsu SSL division. Over 200 million in revenue, almost 1,200 employees. And what they found is they wanted to measure the relationship between their management leadership development and some of their KPIs in the business. And so the key performance indicator that they selected was profitability. They wanted to measure how much their profitability either increased, stayed the same, or what happened over the course of various programs. So what they did is they mapped, and you can see here on this simple graph, you've got profitability measured against sales revenue. And you can see that the Coaching Ourselves program started somewhere between 2010 and 2011 at Fujitsu. And you can, starting in 2011, there was quite a marked increase in the profitability level, right, from about 4% or so, all the way on up to an average of over 8% over the course of these 4 to 5 years. So this is all very nice, and a nice correlation, of course, and you've got sales revenue versus profitability, but it doesn't say almost anything about the specific programs that were used to develop their leaders and managers. So they went a little bit deeper than that. And what they did in the next graph is they mapped for various departments the attendance levels of coaching ourselves groups versus the KPI that was important for them, the profitability level. And they found a very interesting correlation. In this case, it was causation, talking about the social learning, the peer coaching groups, that led to higher profitability. So you notice that Group A, there was only an average attendance rate of about 33% for that department within the organization, and they used profitability as a standard, they called it the 100 level. And then they noticed that as the attendance increased, the participant level increased for these social learning and peer coaching groups, the profitability rates increased at a very similar level. So very interesting here. They almost doubled their profitability just by having their departments increase the attendance of peer coaching and participate in this program. So
if I'm reading this right, this is saying spend more time in this type of meeting and you will be more profitable, which is a bit counterintuitive because most people say, I spend too much time in meetings and I don't have time to get my work done.
True, but remember, when you compare this to other types of leadership development, we're talking about 90-minute sessions that happen on average once per month. So you're not asking a lot from managers, leaders in an organization. Simply 90 minutes once a month. And research has found that continuous learning on a level that's in short bursts, in other words, 90 minutes to 2 hours once a month over the course of a year versus attending a 2-day intensive leadership course, that the continuous learning approach elicits much stronger and much more powerful learning results versus the one-time course, intensive course. So yeah, we believe that these short bursts and the continuous learning and growing together as groups makes a big difference in terms of the organizational performance, overall collaboration of the employees, and leads to improved business results.
So based on this, this is great support for coaching ourselves and social learning being a demonstrated strategy in terms of impact. What then, in terms of ideas or tips, can you offer to learning and development professionals who want to implement social learning in their organization?
Absolutely. So stop focusing on learning as events, as one-time events. Start entrenching it as a continuous performance improved process over the course of whatever a program may be, whether it's 6 months, whether it's 1 year, or even longer. And it's our challenge as L&D professionals to help managers and management, executive level and middle level managers, understand the importance of learning and development. So we need to understand the pain that managers and leaders have that's costing their businesses, that's costing their company. And we need to not only help them understand that pain, articulate it in different ways, but we need to then educate them, inform them, persuade, and communicate the value of ourselves as learning and development professionals. That's a huge challenge for HR and L&D professionals in organizations. And we need to become better at how we do it. Giving managers and leaders opportunities to do things like structured social learning, example, coaching ourselves, for instance, can have a definite impact on how they view learning and development in terms of what value they bring to the business. So what I've done here is I put together a couple of tips to help make social learning work. And I believe that we're going to send this to the participants, to the listeners today, so that they have a one-page document that'll help them understand social learning a little bit better and perhaps use some of these tips. You know, these tips include things like, you know, keeping group size to very intimate numbers. And when I say intimate numbers, 4 to 6 people are ideal sizes of groups for social learning. It just creates more of an intimate gathering. People, you know, rather than have meetings where you've got 8 or 10 people, where, as you know, people tend to hide, and where there's just not enough time for everybody to share their experiences. It's much more powerful when you've created this intimate setting, 4 or 5 people, for example, and they're communicating as humans and creating dialogue rather than serial monologues. Okay, so that's one example of how to make this work. You know, there's other things in this this tip sheet, and as I said, they'll be receiving this tip sheet. But things like you know, establishing the groups and the makeup of these various groups. I mean, we believe that groups should be made up of managers who have no more than one level of hierarchy separation in the organization. The danger here is when you've got too large a separation and you've got a big boss within a group, then people within the tend to say what they think the big boss wants to hear, and that's never going to be productive. So try and keep it to one level of separation. It could be a senior manager, senior director with his team of direct reports, or it can be a cross-functional group made up of managers, directors, VPs from different departments. But you try and keep them in a peer setting where they can actually discuss similar challenges.
Great.
Okay. Do you want to take some questions, Cheddi?
Sure. I'll direct it to the audience and see, you know, comments, reactions, questions. Those of you listening out there, how do you feel about the content, and what comes to mind in terms of types of questions that you might have regarding this? We'll ask you to type them in to the chat box here in the bottom left corner. We've got a question coming in from Maryse, I believe. I saw her typing. Should be appearing here shortly.
So I hope I've introduced this concept of social learning to the listeners, and I hope I've provided them with some ideas on how they can make this work, whether they're consultants, coaches themselves, or whether they're parts of organizations, parts of the HR departments or learning and development professionals within organizations, and want to set up social learning in the organization, peer coaching groups, and so on.
The question from Maryse is, do you think this can be applied with people from different companies?
Good question, Maryse. Thanks very much. So the quick answer is absolutely yes. And the reason I say that is because this methodology, coaching ourselves, has been used by Professor Mintzberg in his international master's program for almost 20 years. That program brings senior managers together from different organizations around the globe. They come together, they're sharing their experiences, and they're using Coaching Ourselves content to help them frame those experiences in a different way. So they're sharing how they manage, how they lead, and how their organization moves management and leadership with each other, and they're effectively learning from each other, whether they're coming from the same organization or different organizations. That being said, there are benefits to using this with managers that come from the same organizations. They already understand the culture of their organization. They understand how management is practiced, and they can share and relate experiences that are meaningful to each other. So, so there are benefits in both sides of the coin here, but absolutely it can be used in a very cross-functional or cross-organizational way, and can also be very powerful. You know, we've got a couple of programs running by some of our partners where it's an open enrollment type leadership program, and they embed coaching ourselves within this program. As I said, bringing managers and leaders together from different organizations, sharing their ideas, sharing the way they practice management in their organization, and that can be very powerful as you bringing back to your own organization and your own divisions.
Here's one that I didn't vet with you before, but I'm curious, Warren, what's your take or what's your view on these being accomplished via, social media / connective platforms, Skype for Business, WebEx, etc. Have you seen that, and what's your take on it?
Yeah, also good question. So, absolutely. I'll give you a very simple framing. We frame this in this way. If you're used to having meetings over conference calls, virtual mediums, and so on, then this just becomes another form of a meeting. It becomes a learning meeting. So if you're used to having status meetings, planning meetings, crisis meetings, whatever they may be, over conference calls or video conference, for instance, then, as I said, this just becomes now a learning meeting. The goal of this meeting is let's improve, let's talk about our experiences, share some ideas, and improve the way we practice management and leadership. And of course, problem solving comes up in these meetings as well. So it relates directly to the business. But as I said, it's a learning meeting. We're hoping to improve the way we practice management, and it can be used very effectively. That being said, as most of us know, it's more difficult having conference call meetings, video conference meetings, and we like to say, try and keep the group size down to smaller numbers. So instead of having potentially 6 people, 4 or 5 people will work better over this type of call. Okay?
That's great and very timely. A similar approach in a mandate recently. Warren, anything else you wanted to share with the audience here today?
Well, as I said, last thing that's been very interesting, and we've found through a couple of different research studies, is we talk about peer coaching groups. And we talk about the difference between social learning and traditional learning. Traditional learning, of course, Cartesian learning, being where information is imparted from an expert, a subject matter expert, an academic, to individuals. There have been studies that have shown that there was no additional value in having peer coaching groups led by either senior people in organizations or external subject matter experts. No added value for the learners. In fact, the impact was diminished for these learners when someone was being told what to do or how to do it, rather than them making sense of their own experiences and figuring out how to improve their practices by themselves. So while you've got peers supporting each other, providing some feedback and providing some new ideas, it's just these ideas that help us make sense of our own experiences and help us to make the learning meaningful and impactful. So very important point, and it really supports this idea of peer learning, peer coaching, rather than having subject matter experts continually try to impart their knowledge.
That makes a lot of sense to me. It somehow highlights the need for shared accountability for learning and developing multiple points of view and insights. And I found that even myself, if I'm facilitating a peer-to-peer learning session, it's one of the major challenges, especially if it's about leadership topics, is for participants to stop turning to me for answers during some of these. And so I want them to turn to each other and to be driving the conversations themselves. And it takes a little while for them to get used to that.
It does. It does. Very similarly, we've seen a lot of the same things that you just described, and it takes a little bit of time, but slowly people start to learn how the process works and how it's going to most benefit them, and that's what peer coaching is.
Yeah. Great, Warren.
So we're very.
Go, please.
No, I was just saying we're, SPB is a long-standing partner, and we've partnered with SPB to bring peer coaching to their clients, and we hope to that this has helped not only the listeners, but as well helped yourself and perhaps the others at SPB in understanding the value of peer coaching, and we hope to grow with you and help your clients put together peer coaching programs.
And fully supported. Thank you so much for taking the time to share this content with us and attend. For those of you who I guess most of our listeners would not have been aware that you and I were in different sites today. Warren was coming to you live from Montreal, and I myself am sitting in Toronto, so glad that we could make this happen. I will be looking forward to us connecting in person here soon again. I want to thank the listeners as well so much for participating and being present throughout the series. I know I saw some names on here today that were there for previous webinars. I can only hope that you found your golden nuggets and that you found certain things interesting and that they're going to stick with you. And as Warren alluded to earlier, we'll be sending the tips sheet to all participants present on today's call or webinar, I'd say. And for those of you interested in discussing any of these topics, you've got my email address here and my LinkedIn contact, and of course you can find SPB's website pretty easily as well. So in any way, shape, or form, if you're interested in discussing any of this, would love to engage with you. Warren, thanks again.
My pleasure, Cheddi. It was wonderful talking with you, and we look forward to seeing you in person.
All right, same here.
All right, thank you.
Everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Bye now.